Hi guys, the night has settled gently over the Nile. The warm air still carries a little of the day's heat, but it has softened now. The river moves slowly through the darkness, reflecting small pieces of moonlight that shimmer and disappear with every quiet ripple. Somewhere in the distance, reeds whisper as a light breeze slips across the water. A few insects sing their steady songs, never rushing, never stopping. The villages along the river have grown quiet. Small oil lamps burn behind mud brick walls, their gentle light reaching only a little way into the night. Take a slow breath. Allow your thoughts to become as calm as the river itself. Tonight, there is nowhere to hurry. There are no battles to fight and no grand ceremonies waiting to begin. Instead, we will spend our time with the ordinary people whose footsteps quietly shaped ancient Egypt every single day. They were the farmers who greeted the sunrise before anyone else. They were the women who mixed flour into bread while the morning air was still cool. They were the fishermen who watched the water before dawn, the builders who carried heavy stones beneath the afternoon sun, the scribes whose careful hands preserved countless ordinary moments, and the children who slowly learned the rhythms of life beside the great river. Their names have mostly faded with time. Yet their days continue to whisper through history. Long before the first light touched the eastern sky, many homes were already beginning to stir. Ancient Egyptian houses were often built from sun-dried mud bricks. The thick walls helped keep the rooms cooler during the hottest hours of the day. Flat roofs collected the coolness of the night, and many families chose to sleep there whenever the weather allowed. Thin woven mats covered the floor, while simple wooden furniture rested quietly against the walls. As the stars slowly faded, someone in the household would awaken first. Perhaps it was the mother, rising softly so she would not disturb the children sleeping nearby. She would move through the dim room by the faint glow of an oil lamp. Her sandals made only the gentlest sound against the packed earth floor. Outside, the village remained wrapped in silence. Even the animals were still resting. She would begin preparing the morning fire. Small pieces of dried wood and bundles of reeds waited beside the cooking place. Soon a tiny flame appeared, glowing softly in the darkness before growing into a warm cooking fire. The smell of smoke mixed with the cool desert air. Clay pots were carefully arranged nearby, along with grinding stones worn smooth from many years of use. Bread was the center of nearly every meal. Its preparation began long before sunrise. Grain harvested months earlier had been carefully stored in baskets and jars. Each morning, some of it was poured onto a flat grinding stone. Another stone was held firmly in both hands and pushed back and forth again and again. The movement was slow but steady. Fine flour gradually collected below. It was difficult work. The arms became tired. The shoulders grew sore. Tiny bits of stone often mixed into the flour, something that slowly wore down the teeth of many Egyptians over the years. Still, the work continued. It was simply another part of life. Nearby, water from the Nile was mixed with the fresh flour. The dough was shaped with practiced hands before being placed into simple clay ovens or directly onto heated stones. Soon the comforting smell of baking bread drifted through the quiet streets. One family after another repeated the same familiar routine. While breakfast slowly cooked, other members of the household began to wake. Children rubbed the sleep from their eyes. Fathers stretched after another night of rest. Grandparents, if they shared the home, greeted the morning with patient familiarity. Life moved gently forward, just as it had yesterday and would again tomorrow. Outside, the eastern horizon slowly turned from deep blue to pale gold. The Nile welcomed another day. The river was the heartbeat of Egypt. Everything depended upon it. Its waters brought life to fields that would otherwise remain dry beneath the endless desert sun. Every year, the flooding waters spread rich black soil across the land. When the water finally retreated, fresh earth remained behind, ready to nourish another season of crops. Farmers understood these rhythms better than anyone. Their calendars were written not only by the stars above but also by the changing behavior of the river below. As daylight strengthened, men and older children gathered their simple tools. Wooden hoes rested across their shoulders. Oxen waited patiently beside narrow paths. Sandals stirred small clouds of dust with every step toward the fields. The air remained pleasantly cool for only a little while longer. Everyone knew that the heat would soon arrive. Morning was the most valuable part of the day. Birds called from the reeds as fishermen prepared their small boats. Their vessels were often built from bundled papyrus or sturdy wooden planks, depending on their work and their means. Nets were folded neatly. Fishing lines were checked with quiet care. The river rewarded patience more often than haste. As boats drifted into the gentle current, the villages slowly became busier. Merchants opened simple stalls along dusty roads. Potters arranged newly fired bowls outside their workshops. Carpenters lifted wooden doors to welcome another day's work. The smell of fresh bread mixed with damp river reeds and warm clay. Nothing happened quickly. Everything unfolded with quiet purpose. In one corner of the village, a young scribe carefully unrolled a sheet of papyrus. His work required clean hands, patient eyes, and steady concentration. Before him rested small cakes of black and red ink beside slender reed pens. Writing was respected throughout Egypt. Few people learned this difficult skill, and those who did often spent years practicing every careful mark. His morning began not with heavy lifting but with quiet attention. Even so, it demanded its own kind of endurance. Hours of careful writing could leave the back aching and the eyes tired beneath the bright afternoon sun. Meanwhile, the farmers had already reached the fields. The soil felt cool beneath their feet. Moist earth clung to their sandals where the river had recently withdrawn. Birds searched the fresh ground for insects while distant cattle moved slowly across the open land. Every movement in the fields carried familiar rhythm. Seeds scattered. Soil covered them. Water channels were opened. Simple tools lifted and fell. Voices remained calm. There was little need for loud conversation. Most people had completed these same tasks since childhood. Their hands remembered the work almost without thinking. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, shadows grew shorter. The warmth increased. The bright light reflected from the pale earth until everything shimmered gently beneath the desert sky. Sweat gathered across tired faces. Clothing clung to sun-warmed skin. Still the work continued, one careful task after another, following the same peaceful rhythm that had shaped life beside the Nile for countless generations. The morning continued to unfold with quiet certainty. The sun rose a little higher above the eastern horizon, and the gentle coolness that had rested over the field slowly gave way to warmth. The light spread across the broad waters of the Nile until the river looked like a long ribbon of polished bronze. Soft ripples carried reflections of reeds, fishing boats, and distant palms, gently breaking each image before joining it together again. The farmers hardly noticed the changing light. Their attention remained on the earth beneath their feet. Each row of grain deserved the same patient care as the one before it. Every handful of seed represented many future meals. Every narrow channel that carried water from the river could make the difference between a healthy harvest and a difficult season. The irrigation ditches stretched across the fields like quiet veins, bringing the Nile's gift into places where the dry ground waited with silent patience. Some men used simple wooden tools to guide the flow of water. Others carefully repaired the low banks of packed mud whenever a small stream escaped its proper path. The work was slow. It was repetitive. It was never hurried. The people understood that the river itself had its own rhythm. There was little use in rushing against it. Nearby, a pair of oxen leaned into a wooden plow. Their steady steps pressed deep tracks into the rich black soil left behind after the annual flood. The farmer walking behind them held the handles with practiced hands. His feet sank slightly into the soft earth with every step. He had likely walked this same field hundreds of times. Perhaps his father had walked it before him. Perhaps his grandfather had done the same. The land remembered many generations. As the sun climbed higher, the voices of birds slowly became quieter. They sought shade among the papyrus and tamarisk trees while the heat settled gently over the valley. The breeze still came from the river, carrying the scent of fresh water mixed with damp reeds and warm mud. It cooled the skin for only a moment before drifting away again. Farther along the riverbank, fishermen waited with remarkable patience. Their small boats rested almost without movement on the calm water. Nets lay neatly folded until the right moment arrived. Some fishermen stood quietly with long poles, gently guiding their boats through patches of reeds where fish often gathered beneath the shade. The silence was comfortable. There was no need to fill every moment with conversation. The river itself provided enough company. Its gentle sounds had been part of their lives since childhood. Water touched the sides of the boats with soft, repeating taps. A fish occasionally disturbed the smooth surface with a quick splash before disappearing beneath the current once again. One fisherman slowly lifted his net. Tiny drops of water sparkled in the bright sunlight before falling back into the river. A few silver fish moved gently inside the woven fibers. It was not an extraordinary catch, but it was enough to bring food to the family waiting at home. Enough was often all that people hoped for. In the village, the streets had become busier. Dust rose softly beneath hundreds of sandals moving from one workshop to another. Donkeys carried baskets filled with grain, pottery, bundles of flax, or freshly cut reeds. Their slow footsteps blended with the quiet conversations of neighbors greeting one another as another ordinary day unfolded. Children helped wherever they could. Some carried water in small clay jars. Others gathered sticks for cooking fires. A few followed older family members closely, watching every movement with careful eyes. Learning often happened this way, not inside a special place for lessons, but through many ordinary days spent beside parents, grandparents, older brothers, and older sisters. A little boy watched his mother knead fresh dough. She folded it again and again with gentle strength, adding a little more flour whenever it became too soft beneath her hands. He watched without speaking. Soon enough his own hands would learn the same movements. Across the narrow lane, an elderly potter sat beside his wheel. His hands carried the memory of thousands of finished vessels. A lump of damp clay rested before him. As the wheel slowly turned, his fingers pressed lightly against its sides. Almost without effort, the clay began changing shape. A simple bowl appeared. Then another. Then a narrow jar with a rounded body and a slender neck. Each piece looked slightly different, yet all belonged to the same quiet tradition passed through many years of patient work. The clay itself had come from the Nile. After every flood, rich deposits settled along the riverbanks. Potters gathered the smooth earth, mixing it carefully before shaping it into objects that would become part of nearly every home. Water jars, cooking pots, storage vessels, oil lamps, bread molds, small cups. Everyday life rested inside these simple creations. Once finished, the pots dried beneath the warm Egyptian sun before being placed into carefully built kilns. Fire transformed the soft clay into something strong enough to serve families for many years. The smell of smoke drifted gently above the village. Nearby, weavers sat beneath shaded roofs where the sunlight became softer. Bundles of flax rested beside them. The delicate fibers had already been separated, cleaned, and spun into long threads. Now those threads stretched across wooden looms. Hands moved with calm precision. Thread passed over. Then under. Again. And again. The growing cloth slowly appeared as though it had always been waiting inside the threads themselves. The work demanded patience more than speed. Hours passed almost unnoticed. The quiet rhythm of weaving became as steady as breathing. Outside, the streets shimmered beneath the strengthening heat. By the middle of the day, the sun ruled everything. Stone walls grew warm to the touch. The dusty roads reflected bright light upward. Even the smallest patches of shade became welcome places to pause. Workers often rested briefly during the hottest hours. Some sat beneath palm trees where broad leaves softened the sunlight. Others leaned against cool mud brick walls while sharing simple meals carried from home. Bread remained at the center of nearly every meal. Pieces were broken apart by hand and eaten alongside onions, beans, lentils, dates, figs, or small portions of fish when available. Sometimes there was cheese. Sometimes fresh greens gathered from nearby gardens added color to the meal. Water refreshed the body, but many people also drank a mild beer made from grain. It was thicker than the drinks people know today and served as an important part of everyday nourishment. Adults and children alike often shared it with meals. The conversations during these quiet pauses remained gentle. Neighbors spoke about the condition of the fields. They wondered how high the river might rise during the next flood. Someone mentioned a daughter's coming marriage. Someone else smiled while describing a newborn child. These were ordinary conversations carried by ordinary lives. History often remembers the names of kings. Yet days like these belong to everyone else. As the afternoon continued, many workers returned to their tasks. The builders outside the village lifted blocks of limestone onto wooden sledges. Teams of men worked together, matching their strength to one another instead of competing against it. Their movements became almost musical. Lift. Step. Breathe. Lower. Rest. Then begin again. Sweat rolled slowly down their faces. Their shoulders carried the weight of the stone. The bright sunlight reflected from pale rock until the entire work site seemed wrapped in warm light. Water carriers moved quietly among them, offering cool drinks drawn from clay jars kept beneath damp cloths. Every sip mattered beneath the Egyptian sun. The builders paused only long enough to catch their breath before returning once more to the familiar rhythm of work. Nearby, a young apprentice watched carefully. He could not yet carry the heaviest stones. Instead, he observed. He learned where to place his hands. He learned how several people could move together without speaking very much. He learned that careful work lasted longer than hurried work. These lessons became part of him little by little, carried not in books but in the memory of his muscles and the quiet example of older workers. The afternoon stretched onward with the slow certainty that seemed to belong only to the Nile Valley. Nothing rushed. Nothing needed to prove itself. The river continued its patient journey toward the northern sea, just as it had for countless generations, while the people beside its banks continued shaping their own small part of history through ordinary moments that rarely found their way into monuments, yet quietly sustained the entire kingdom. The afternoon drifted onward with quiet patience. The sun still rested high above the valley, filling the wide sky with a pale brightness that seemed almost without end. Heat settled gently over the fields, the villages, and the broad river that continued its slow journey north. The distant desert shimmered beneath the light, its sandy hills appearing soft around the edges, as though the warm air itself had become part of the landscape. Life did not stop because of the heat. It simply moved a little more slowly. The builders lifted their tools with measured hands. The potters shaped another vessel. The weavers guided another thread across the loom. Farmers paused now and then beneath the shade of a date palm before returning once more to the work waiting in the fields. Nothing felt hurried. The day unfolded one careful moment after another. Along the edge of the Nile, women walked toward the river carrying smooth clay jars balanced with quiet confidence. Some rested the jars against one shoulder. Others placed folded cloth upon their heads before lifting the vessels into place. They followed narrow footpaths that had been worn into the earth by countless generations before them. The river welcomed them with its familiar calm. They knelt near the water, filling each jar slowly to keep the cool liquid clear. Tiny ripples spread across the surface with every careful movement. Fish darted through the shallows before disappearing beneath waving reeds. For a few peaceful moments, the women remained there. Some exchanged soft conversations. Others simply listened. The gentle splash of water. The rustle of papyrus. The distant cry of water birds. These sounds had accompanied nearly every day of their lives. The filled jars were heavy. Their return home required steady balance and practiced strength. Each careful step carried water that would be used for drinking, cooking, washing, mixing bread, and countless other daily needs. Every household depended upon these quiet journeys to the river. Back in the village, the smell of baking continued to drift through the warm air. One oven cooled while another was being prepared. Fresh loaves rested upon woven mats, their crusts turning a gentle golden brown. Some were round. Others were shaped to fit special clay molds that had been passed from one generation to the next. Children wandered close, drawn by the familiar scent. A mother smiled as she broke away a small piece of warm bread. Tiny hands reached forward. Simple moments like these were easily forgotten by history, yet they formed the heart of everyday life. Inside another home, flax fibers waited to become linen. An elderly grandmother sat beside her daughter, showing a young girl how to twist the delicate strands between careful fingers. The child watched closely, her first attempts uneven and loose. The older woman did not hurry her. She simply demonstrated again. Patient hands often taught better than many words. The afternoon light entered through a small opening near the roof, creating soft bands of brightness across the mud brick floor. Dust floated quietly within those narrow beams before settling once more. Outside, the streets remained busy, though the pace had softened. A merchant slowly arranged baskets filled with dried dates, onions, garlic, lentils, and fragrant herbs gathered from nearby gardens. Customers stopped to examine the day's offerings. They did not rush their decisions. Trade was as much about conversation as it was about exchange. A handful of grain might be offered. A woven basket. Fresh vegetables. A carefully made clay pot. Many goods moved from one family to another through simple agreements built upon trust that had grown over many years. Nearby, a carpenter worked beneath the shade of a simple shelter. His tools were few but carefully cared for. A wooden mallet rested beside smooth chisels. Thin curls of wood gathered around his feet as he shaped a small stool from imported timber. Good wood was precious in Egypt, where large forests were uncommon. Cedar brought from distant lands was especially valued, while local acacia and sycamore also served many practical purposes. Nothing was wasted. Even the smallest pieces found another use. The carpenter paused from time to time, brushing fine dust from the smooth surface with the palm of his hand. He ran his fingers gently across the grain. Satisfied, he continued. Across the village, a group of children invented quiet games beneath the shade of a palm. They drew simple patterns into the dusty ground with small sticks. Sometimes they tossed smooth pebbles from hand to hand. Sometimes they chased one another between narrow lanes until the afternoon warmth reminded them to slow once again. Their laughter rose briefly before fading back into the ordinary sounds of village life. Even joy seemed gentle beneath the Egyptian sun. Not far away, an older scribe remained seated inside a cool administrative room. Bundles of rolled papyrus rested neatly upon low shelves. Each document represented grain collected, tools distributed, fields measured, or workers assigned to important tasks. The scribe dipped his reed pen into black ink. With calm concentration, he added another careful line of graceful symbols. His shoulders had become stiff after many hours of sitting. He slowly stretched his fingers before returning once again to the page. His work demanded quiet attention rather than physical strength, yet it carried its own form of weariness. The eyes grew tired. The back ached. Still, the records continued. Without them, much of the kingdom's daily organization would have slowly unraveled. Outside, shadows had begun to lengthen almost unnoticed. The sun remained bright, but its light had softened ever so slightly. The hottest hours were passing. Farmers welcomed the change. They continued tending small vegetable gardens close to their homes, where onions, beans, lettuce, cucumbers, and herbs grew in carefully watered soil. Children helped carry small buckets from nearby canals, pouring precious water around each plant with surprising care. Gardens demanded daily attention. Unlike the great fields nourished by the annual flood, these smaller plots relied upon constant work. Each green leaf reflected many quiet hours of effort. Along the riverbank, fishermen prepared for another cast of their nets. The afternoon breeze had strengthened a little. It carried the scent of fresh water mixed with damp earth and flowering plants that grew near the canals. One fisherman stood silently in his narrow boat. With practiced movement, he gathered the weighted edge of his net. Then, in one smooth motion, he released it. The woven circle opened gracefully in the air before settling upon the river with hardly a splash. For a moment everything became still. Then the weight slowly disappeared beneath the surface. The fisherman waited. Patience was often rewarded more generously than haste. Nearby, white birds stood motionless in the shallows. Their reflections stretched across the quiet water until gentle ripples carried them away. The Nile seemed to breathe with slow, peaceful rhythm. It asked nothing except respect. It gave life in return. As the afternoon leaned toward evening, workers gradually finished the most demanding tasks of the day. Heavy tools were cleaned. Ropes were neatly coiled. Clay vessels were covered to protect them from dust. Animals were guided toward shaded enclosures where fresh water and feed waited. The oxen lowered their heads gratefully. Donkeys stood quietly while children brushed dust from their coats. Even the animals seemed to understand that the hardest hours had passed. Smoke began rising once again from household cooking fires. Thin gray ribbons drifted upward into the warm evening air. The smell of roasting fish mingled with fresh bread, lentils gently simmering inside clay pots, onions softening over small fires, and herbs releasing their quiet fragrance. Families slowly gathered. One by one, familiar footsteps returned through the narrow streets. Builders came home with tired shoulders. Farmers arrived carrying simple tools worn smooth by years of use. Fishermen brought woven baskets holding the day's catch. Children greeted them with quiet excitement. The day's labor was giving way to the evening's rest. The village itself seemed to breathe more slowly. Voices remained gentle. The light became softer. Long shadows stretched across the dusty lanes while the first hints of cooler air drifted in from the river. Soon, the sun would begin its peaceful descent beyond the western desert, and another familiar evening would settle over ancient Egypt, just as it had for generations beyond counting. The afternoon slowly surrendered to evening. The bright light that had rested over the Nile Valley since morning began to soften. The sky changed so gradually that few people noticed the moment it began. The pale blue above became warmer, touched with gentle shades of gold that stretched across the river and settled upon the fields. The heat remained, but it was no longer heavy. A cool breath drifted over the water. The reeds answered with a quiet rustling that seemed almost like a whispered conversation carried from one bank to the other. Along the dusty paths leading back from the fields, small groups of farmers walked home together. Their sandals brushed the dry earth with slow, tired steps. Wooden hoes rested across worn shoulders. Empty baskets swung gently from rough hands. Their clothing held the fine dust of the day, and their skin carried the warmth of many hours beneath the Egyptian sun. No one hurried. The work was finished for now. Tomorrow would arrive soon enough. One farmer paused for a moment near an irrigation canal. He bent down, cupped both hands into the cool water, and gently washed the dust from his face. The river water felt refreshing after the long afternoon. Tiny circles spread across the surface before fading into the quiet current. He stood for another moment. There was no reason to rush home. The evening itself invited people to move slowly. Nearby, a pair of children wandered along the edge of the canal collecting smooth stones. They examined each one carefully before placing a few into small woven baskets. Some stones would become simple toys. Others might help weigh down fishing nets or hold open woven mats drying outside the family home. Even ordinary objects found many purposes. Very little was ever wasted. As the sun drifted lower, the birds became more active once again. White ibises lifted gracefully from the marshes, their wings catching the golden light. Small swallows darted above the water, chasing insects that hovered over the quiet surface. Farther away, a heron stood perfectly still, watching the shallows with endless patience. The sounds of the village slowly changed. During the hottest hours, work had filled the air. Now the voices became softer. People greeted neighbors returning from the fields. Children called to one another from narrow lanes. Goats answered with quiet bleats while chickens settled near simple wooden shelters for the coming night. The village was alive, yet peaceful. Inside one mud brick home, a cooking fire burned with a gentle glow. The day's final meal was slowly taking shape. A clay pot rested above the small flame. Lentils simmered quietly inside, filling the room with a warm, earthy aroma. Beside them, onions softened in another vessel while fresh herbs added a gentle fragrance that drifted toward the doorway. The mother moved carefully around the small cooking space. Years of practice had made every movement smooth. She added water. She stirred the pot. She broke fresh bread into portions for each member of the family. Nearby, her youngest daughter carefully arranged simple bowls upon a woven mat spread across the floor. She counted each bowl twice. No one had asked her to. She simply wanted to make sure everyone had a place. Across the room, an older brother returned carrying a bundle of dry reeds gathered before sunset. He leaned them neatly against the wall where they would remain ready for tomorrow's fire. Their father entered a few moments later. His shoulders were tired. His hands showed small cuts left by rough tools and coarse plants in the fields. Yet when he stepped inside, the day's labor slowly slipped away. Home offered something the fields could not: rest. The family gathered close together. There were no large tables. Many households simply shared meals while seated upon woven mats. The room remained modest. Mud brick walls held the coolness of approaching evening. A small oil lamp waited nearby, though there was still enough daylight to see without it. They ate slowly. Fresh bread was torn by hand. Lentils were shared. A few dates rested in a small basket for the end of the meal. Some evenings included fish from the river. Other evenings offered beans, vegetables, or cheese. The meals were simple, yet they carried comfort through their familiarity. No one expected great variety. The steady presence of food itself brought quiet gratitude. As they ate, conversation drifted gently around the room. The father spoke of a neighbor whose irrigation channel needed repair before the next watering. The mother mentioned that fresh grain would soon need grinding. The older children discussed the work they hoped to finish tomorrow before the sun climbed too high. The youngest listened more than she spoke. She watched every face. She learned the rhythm of family simply by sitting among them. Outside, the last sunlight rested upon the tops of the palm trees. Long shadows stretched across the village. The dusty streets slowly emptied. Merchants covered their goods with woven cloth. Potters stacked finished bowls inside sheltered corners where they would cool overnight. Carpenters gathered their tools into simple wooden boxes. One by one, the sounds of labor faded. Near the riverbank, fishermen guided their boats gently toward shore. The day's catch rested inside woven baskets lined with damp reeds. The boat slid quietly onto the soft mud. Ropes were tied. Nets were carefully rinsed in the river before hanging to dry. A torn section was repaired immediately. Small holes ignored today would become larger tomorrow. Patient work saved many future troubles. The fishermen lingered beside the water for a few peaceful moments. The river reflected the evening sky with remarkable stillness. Golden colors slowly deepened into amber. Soon they would become purple and blue. The Nile never seemed hurried. Its endless movement offered the same quiet lesson every day. Time continued forward without noise. Along one narrow lane, an elderly woman swept the ground outside her doorway using a bundle of reeds tied together with flax cord. Fine dust lifted into the evening light before settling again. The doorway looked little different afterward. Still, she smiled softly. The task had become part of every evening for as long as she could remember. Some routines needed no special reason. They simply belonged to life. Nearby, another family climbed a short staircase leading to the flat roof of their home. The air above the village already felt cooler. Children enjoyed these quiet moments before sleep. They looked across the rooftops where neighbors prepared for another peaceful night. Here and there, someone spread woven sleeping mats. Another family folded light linen cloths that would serve as blankets if the air became cool before dawn. The first stars slowly appeared above the eastern horizon. One by one, they emerged from the fading light. Ancient Egyptians often looked toward the night sky with deep familiarity. The stars marked the passing seasons. They guided travelers. They reminded farmers of the changing year. To many families, they also offered simple beauty after the brightness of the day. No special celebration was needed. Looking upward became its own quiet tradition. Far below, the village settled even further into evening. Oil lamps flickered softly inside homes. Their gentle flames cast warm circles of light against the smooth mud walls. Shadows moved slowly as families finished their meals and cleaned simple clay bowls with water carried from the Nile. Children began to yawn. The excitement of the day had quietly disappeared. Their eyelids grew heavy. Some curled beside parents while stories were told in calm voices. Perhaps they listened to tales of wise animals, kind spirits, hard-working ancestors, or the dependable river that had cared for generations beyond memory. The stories were not hurried. Like the river itself, they flowed gently from one sentence into the next. Outside, the breeze strengthened ever so slightly. Palm leaves brushed against one another with soft, steady whispers. Somewhere beyond the houses, a donkey shifted its weight before becoming still again. A dog lifted its head for a moment, listening to distant sounds carried across the fields, then settled once more. The village breathed with the peaceful rhythm of people who had worked hard beneath the sun and now welcomed the quiet gift of evening. The Nile continued its endless journey through the darkness, carrying cool water past fields, villages, temples, and reeds that sway gently beneath the growing moon. Its calm current would remain through the night, just as it had through countless nights before, waiting patiently for another dawn to awaken the ordinary lives that quietly shaped the story of ancient Egypt. Night settled gently across the Nile Valley. The last glow of the sun slowly disappeared beyond the western horizon, leaving behind a sky that deepened from soft violet into a rich, quiet blue. One by one, the stars appeared above the river, each shining with a calm steadiness. Their reflections rested upon the slow-moving water, trembling only when a gentle current passed beneath them. The warmth of the day slowly drifted away. The desert, which had gathered the sun's heat for many hours, now began to release it back into the cool evening air. A pleasant breeze wandered through the village streets, carrying the scent of damp earth from the canals, fresh reeds from the riverbank, and the faint smoke of cooking fires that were slowly fading into glowing embers. Most of the day's work had come to an end. The sounds that remained were quiet ones. A distant conversation floated across a courtyard. A clay bowl was carefully placed upon a shelf. A wooden door closed with a gentle thud. Sandals brushed softly against packed earth as the last neighbors returned to their homes. Nothing disturbed the peaceful rhythm of the evening. Inside one modest house, the family had nearly finished preparing for sleep. The youngest children had already washed the dust from their hands and faces with cool water poured from a smooth clay jar. Their mother folded simple linen garments and placed them neatly beside woven sleeping mats. The father sat quietly near the doorway. For a few moments, he did nothing at all. His hands rested upon his knees. The muscles in his shoulders slowly relaxed after a long day guiding oxen through heavy soil. Small cuts across his palms had already begun to dry in the cool night air. He listened. The quiet itself was comforting. There was the steady chirping of insects hidden among the reeds. The distant croak of frogs near the river. The soft rustling of palm leaves overhead. These familiar sounds had accompanied nearly every evening of his life. He knew them as well as he knew the faces of his own family. Nearby, an elderly grandfather slowly climbed the narrow staircase leading to the roof of the house. His steps were careful. The smooth mud brick stairs had carried many feet through many years. At the top, he spread a woven mat across the flat roof and looked out across the sleeping village. From here, the world seemed wonderfully peaceful. Small lamps glowed here and there among the rooftops like tiny golden stars resting upon the earth. Beyond the houses, the dark ribbon of the Nile quietly reflected the heavens above. The old man remembered sleeping beneath these same stars when he had been a child. His father had pointed toward familiar constellations. His grandfather had done the very same before him. Some traditions required no written record. They lived quietly in memory. Across the village, another family remained awake a little longer. A grandmother sat with two children beside a small oil lamp. Its flame flickered gently whenever the breeze found its way through the doorway. She slowly repaired a piece of linen that had worn thin after many months of daily use. The children watched the needle pass through the cloth again and again. They asked quiet questions. She answered each one patiently. Sometimes she paused to tell a simple story. Not one filled with great kings or mighty battles, but stories about ordinary people whose kindness, honesty, or patience had become examples for younger generations. The children leaned closer. The lamp painted warm circles of light across their faces. Outside, the village grew quieter still. Even the animals had settled. The goats lay close together inside their small enclosure. The donkeys rested after carrying heavy loads throughout the day. Chickens tucked themselves beneath simple shelters, their feathers rising and falling with slow, peaceful breaths. Only the occasional owl broke the silence as it called softly from a nearby tree. Farther along the river, a fisherman remained beside his boat. He had repaired a torn section of his net by lamplight and now sat looking across the calm water. Tomorrow, long before sunrise, he would return to the river once again. There was comfort in knowing what the next morning would bring. The Nile followed its own steady rhythm. So did the people who depended upon it. He dipped one hand into the cool water. Tiny ripples spread outward beneath the moonlight. For a few quiet moments, he watched them disappear into the darkness. The river never seemed impatient. It flowed without hurry. Without complaint. Without pause. Its quiet movement had shaped every generation that lived beside its banks. Children learned to walk near its shores. Farmers watched its yearly flood with hope. Merchants traveled upon its waters. Builders floated great stones from distant quarries. Mothers carried water home in clay jars filled from its edge. Old men sat beside it at sunset remembering lives filled with ordinary work. The river connected every story. Even in the silence of night, it continued moving northward, unseen except where moonlight rested upon its surface. Inside another home, a young apprentice scribe unrolled a small piece of papyrus before sleeping. His teacher had given him a few symbols to practice before tomorrow's lesson. He dipped his reed pen into black ink. Carefully, he formed each sign. The first was uneven. The second looked a little better. By the fifth attempt, his hand moved with greater confidence. He smiled quietly to himself. Learning required patience. Every experienced scribe had once struggled with the very same marks. Satisfied, he rolled the papyrus once more and carefully placed it inside a woven basket where it would remain safe until morning. His lamp burned low. Soon it would be extinguished. Elsewhere, the last cooking fires faded into glowing red embers. A woman carefully covered warm bread with linen cloth to keep it fresh for the morning meal. She checked the water jars. She gathered a few remaining vegetables into a basket. She looked around the small room one final time. Everything was ready. Tomorrow's work had already begun in these small preparations made before sleep. Outside, the moon climbed higher into the sky. Its gentle light touched the white limestone of distant buildings, making them appear almost silver against the darkness. Palm trees cast long shadows across quiet courtyards. The breeze carried the sweet scent of flowering plants growing near carefully tended gardens. For those still awake, the night offered welcome relief from the day's heat. Many families chose to sleep upon the flat roofs of their homes whenever the weather remained pleasant. Mats were unrolled one beside another. Simple linen cloth served as light coverings. Children settled beside their parents. Some whispered softly for a few moments. Others had already fallen asleep before the stars reached their brightest. Above them stretched a sky unlike any roof built by human hands. The stars seemed endless. Their gentle light had watched over countless generations. Perhaps somewhere beneath those same stars, a young farmer wondered what tomorrow's weather might bring. A little girl dreamed of learning to weave as skillfully as her mother. A fisherman hoped for calm waters at dawn. A builder silently wished that his aching shoulders would feel stronger after a night's rest. These were quiet hopes. Simple hopes. They filled ordinary lives with quiet purpose. The night embraced them all equally. No palace walls could keep out the cool breeze. No humble house was forgotten by the moon. The silence belonged to everyone. As the hours passed, even the insects seemed to soften their songs. The village rested. The fields rested. The boats tied gently along the riverbank rocked almost imperceptibly with the slow movement of the Nile. The world itself seemed to breathe more slowly. And somewhere beyond the dark fields, where the fertile land slowly gave way to endless desert, the first faint promise of another dawn waited patiently beyond the horizon, still many peaceful hours away. The night deepened further, settling over the Nile like a soft, dark cloth laid gently across the world. The village had grown almost completely still now. What remained was not silence exactly, but something softer. A layered quiet made of small, distant sounds that never truly disappear in a place where people live close to the river and the land. A faint breeze moved through palm fronds. Water shifted slowly along the banks. Somewhere far off, a night bird called once, then fell silent again. Above everything, the stars continued their slow presence. They did not move in any way the eye could easily notice. They simply remained, steady and patient, as though they had always been there and would always continue to be there long after the village itself had grown quiet in memory. On the rooftops, most people were already asleep. Bodies rested on woven mats warmed earlier by the day's sun. Linen cloths rose and fell with slow breathing. A few figures still shifted gently in their sleep, adjusting to the coolness that deepened as the hours passed. The grandfather who had climbed to the roof earlier now lay still, his eyes open for a time as he looked upward. The sky above him was vast. In his youth, he had believed it to be endless. With age, he no longer thought in such large words. It was simply the sky. Always returning. Always watching. Always present above the river and fields. His thoughts drifted quietly. Not in clear sentences, but in soft impressions. The memory of early mornings in the fields. The feeling of wet soil beneath bare feet after the flood waters withdrew. The sound of grinding grain from long ago when his own mother had prepared bread in the same patient rhythm. None of these memories arrived sharply. They came like the river itself. Slowly. Gently. Without urgency. He closed his eyes at last. The roof beneath him held the last warmth of the day, and the cool air above carried the promise of rest. Below, inside the village, the night continued its steady passage. A small lamp still burned in one home where a woman remained awake a little longer than the others. She sat near a low clay bowl filled with water, carefully washing the dust from a few vegetables saved for tomorrow's meal. Her movements were unhurried. The glow of the lamp turned the edges of her hands into soft gold. Outside, the darkness pressed gently against the walls of the house, not as something threatening, but as something familiar. A presence known every night of her life. She paused for a moment and listened. Her children were asleep in the next room. Her husband's breathing was slow and even. The house itself seemed to settle deeper into stillness with every passing minute. She finished her small task and placed the cleaned vegetables into a woven basket. Then she extinguished the lamp. The light faded without resistance. The room did not become empty. It simply returned to shadow. She lay down beside her family and closed her eyes. Now the village was nearly complete in its rest. Only a few places near the river still held movement. The Nile itself never truly slept. It continued its slow, deliberate journey through the darkness, guided by forces older than memory. Its surface reflected the sky in fragments, broken pieces of moonlight that shifted and reformed with every gentle ripple. Along one quiet bend in the river, a fisherman remained awake. Not working now. Only watching. His boat was tied carefully to a wooden post driven into the riverbank. The net he had repaired earlier lay folded beside him. He sat with his knees drawn close, his back resting against the side of the boat. The night air felt cooler here. Cooler than the village. Cooler than the fields. He dipped his hand into the water again, slowly, almost absent-mindedly. The river responded in the same way it always did. A soft touch. A quiet ripple. A brief distortion of reflected starlight. He had spent most of his life near this water. He knew its moods in the way people know familiar voices. Sometimes it moved a little faster after rains in distant lands. Sometimes it became almost still, as though listening to something far beyond the reach of human hearing. Tonight it was calm. Steady. Untroubled. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened to the river instead of watching it. There was a kind of comfort in it. A reminder that even while people slept, life continued in its quiet way. Fish moved beneath the surface. Reeds shifted with the current. Tiny currents formed and dissolved without beginning or end. Everything belonged to a rhythm larger than any single day. Farther inland, beyond the sleeping homes and darkened fields, the desert waited in silence. It did not move. It did not change in any visible way. Yet it was never truly still. The wind passed over its surface, shaping small ridges and soft patterns that would not remain for long. The desert held the memory of heat, even in the coolness of night. And beyond it all, the horizon remained empty and wide. Not empty in a lifeless sense, but open. A vast space where dawn would eventually return without hurry, as it always had. Inside the village, sleep deepened. Children who had once resisted sleep now lay still without effort. Their breathing slowed. Their hands relaxed. The day's small excitements faded into gentle dreams that no one would later remember clearly, though they would feel their warmth upon waking. The adults slept more deeply, their bodies releasing the weight of labor carried throughout the day. Muscles softened. Shoulders eased. Hands unclenched. The physical memory of work remained, but it no longer pressed upon them. Even the village itself seemed to rest in structure and form. Walls that had held heat through the afternoon now cooled slowly. Doorways stood open or closed depending on the habits of each household. Courtyards lay undisturbed, their surfaces marked only by the faint traces of daily movement that would be renewed again in the morning. Time passed without announcement. There were no markers in the night to declare its progress. Only the gradual shift of stars across the sky and the steady presence of the river moving through darkness. The fisherman by the riverbank finally lay down inside his boat. He pulled a thin cloth over his body. His eyes remained open for a short while, adjusting to the sky above him. The stars seemed closer here, reflected in the water so clearly that it became difficult to tell where sky ended and river began. He thought of tomorrow without urgency. There would be nets to cast. Water to read. Silence to wait through. Then perhaps a good catch, or perhaps a small one. Either was acceptable. He closed his eyes. The boat shifted gently with the river's movement, rocking in a rhythm that matched the slow breathing of the night itself. And so the Nile Valley continued its quiet existence under the stars. A place where life did not pause when people slept. It simply softened. And waited, patiently, for morning to return once again. The deepest hours of night settled over ancient Egypt. This was the time when even the smallest sounds seemed to drift farther, as though the world itself had stepped back into a softer distance. The Nile still moved, but so slowly it felt more like breathing than flowing. The current carried fragments of moonlight downstream, broken into pale silver lines that stretched and dissolved without effort. Along the riverbanks, the reeds stood still. Their shadows lay long and faint across the water, barely visible except when a passing ripple shifted the reflection of the sky. In the village, sleep had fully taken hold. There were no more lamps burning now. No more footsteps. No more quiet tasks being finished in the corners of homes. Only the steady presence of rest, shared across every household, from the smallest mud brick dwelling to the larger homes of scribes and overseers. Inside one home, a child shifted slightly in sleep. One hand rested against a woven mat, fingers loose and still. The cool night air slipped gently through a small opening near the roof, touching the child's face before moving on without disturbance. Nearby, the mother slept lightly, as many parents do, always half aware even in rest. Her breathing was calm. Her body remained still, but her awareness seemed to hover near the edges of sleep, ready to respond if needed. Nothing needed her. The night was kind in its quietness. Outside, the narrow street between homes was empty. Earlier footprints from the day had softened in the dust. The wind had gently erased the sharper edges of movement, smoothing everything into a uniform surface that would hold new traces when morning returned. A small dog lay curled near a doorway, its body rising and falling slowly. Every so often, it twitched slightly in sleep, perhaps chasing some invisible memory of movement or sound. Then it returned again to stillness. Far beyond the village, the fields rested under the open sky. Rows of grain stood in silent patience. Irrigation channels held still water that reflected the stars in long, broken lines. The earth, worked so carefully through the day, now lay undisturbed, as if it too had entered its own form of sleep. The desert beyond the fields was vast and quiet. Its silence was different from the village silence. Heavier. Older. It held no sound of human life, only the faintest suggestion of wind moving across sand that had been shaped and reshaped for countless ages. Even in darkness, the desert did not feel empty. It felt complete in its own way, as though it required nothing beyond itself. The Nile continued its slow journey between these two worlds. Life on one side, stillness on the other. And yet both belonged to the same landscape. On a small stretch of river near the sleeping village, a single boat remained gently anchored. The fisherman inside it slept now, his body wrapped in a thin cloth against the coolness of the night. His breathing matched the slow rocking of the boat. Every movement of water beneath him carried him slightly, then returned him again to place. The rope that held the boat was tied with practiced care. It would not loosen easily. It had been secured in the same way many times before, as part of a routine that required no thought anymore. Above him, the sky was at its most open. The stars seemed endless now, scattered across the darkness with quiet precision. Some shone brighter than others, but none felt distant in a way that made them unreachable. They simply existed, steady and patient, like the river itself. If one could have risen above the land in this moment, the view would have been a long stretch of darkness broken only by faint signs of life. A soft glow where a village slept. A thin silver line marking the Nile. A vast surrounding darkness of desert and sky. Everything held in balance. Everything resting. Even the wind had grown gentler. It moved across the river only occasionally, brushing the surface lightly enough to create brief ripples that vanished almost immediately. The water then returned to its earlier calm, as though nothing had disturbed it at all. Time passed without marking itself clearly. There were no bells. No announcements. No changes in light beyond the slow turning of the stars. Yet somewhere, far beyond the edge of the visible horizon, the first suggestion of change was beginning. Not yet dawn. Not yet even light. Only the quiet shift that happens long before anything can be seen. The air held a slightly different stillness. The darkness, though still deep, felt as though it was preparing to loosen its hold. But in the village, nothing needed to notice this yet. Everything continued sleeping. Farmers remained folded into rest after long hours in the fields. Weavers lay beside their looms, their hands finally still after countless repetitions. Builders rested with the weight of stone removed from their bodies. Children slept without awareness of time at all. Even the scribes, who often carried thoughts into sleep more than others, had let go of ink, papyrus, and careful symbols. All of it waited. The Nile did not hurry them. It never had. It moved at its own pace, carrying the memory of distant rains and mountain waters far to the south, bringing life steadily northward without interruption. And in return, the people matched its rhythm. Not in effort, but in way of living. Slow. Steady. Patient. As the night reached its quietest point, the world seemed to hold itself gently in place. The river. The fields. The desert. The homes. All resting together under the same sky. And somewhere in that deep stillness, without announcement or urgency, the first faint suggestion of approaching morning continued to form beyond the edge of darkness, waiting for its time to arrive. The night slowly began to loosen its gentle hold upon the Nile Valley. The change was so quiet that no one could point to the exact moment it began. The stars still filled the sky, bright and steady, yet the darkness beneath them seemed just a little softer. Far to the east, beyond the river, beyond the green fields, and beyond the distant line where the desert met the heavens, a faint gray light quietly gathered behind the horizon. The village remained asleep. Roofs that had been covered with woven sleeping mats only hours before were still filled with resting families. Children lay close to their parents beneath light linen cloths. An elderly couple slept peacefully side by side, their hands resting only a few inches apart after a lifetime spent together. The cool air of the final hours before dawn settled gently over every home. It slipped through narrow windows and open doorways, carrying with it the fresh scent of river water and damp earth. The warmth stored in the mud brick walls during the day slowly faded, leaving the rooms pleasantly cool. This was one of the quietest moments in the entire day. Even the insects seemed to sing more softly. The frogs near the river paused between their calls. The breeze moved carefully through the papyrus reeds, making only the faintest whisper as each tall stem brushed against another. The Nile itself reflected the stars with remarkable clarity. The surface was almost perfectly smooth. Only now and then did a fish rise beneath the water, leaving behind a widening circle that gently disturbed the reflections before everything became still once more. A fisherman sleeping inside his small wooden boat stirred slightly. He opened his eyes for only a moment. Above him stretched the familiar blanket of stars. He listened without moving. The river. The reeds. The breeze. Nothing else. Satisfied that there was still time before work would begin, he closed his eyes once again and allowed himself a few more peaceful moments of sleep. Back in the village, the old grandfather upon the rooftop awakened before anyone else. Age had slowly changed his habits. He no longer slept as deeply as he once had. He remained lying quietly on his woven mat, watching the eastern sky without speaking a single word. He had witnessed thousands of mornings. Yet each one arrived with its own gentle beauty. There was comfort in their certainty. No matter what had happened during the previous day, the dawn always returned. The stars nearest the horizon slowly began to fade. Not all at once. One after another. Their light gently disappeared into the growing brightness waiting beyond the desert. The old man smiled almost without realizing it. He enjoyed this quiet hour. No tools. No conversations. No responsibilities. Only the peaceful meeting of night and morning. Below him, the village remained wrapped in sleep. A young mother turned slightly upon her mat as her youngest child nestled closer beside her. The little one breathed slowly, still dreaming. Nearby, the father remained sound asleep, one arm resting across his forehead after the long labor of yesterday. His hands still carried faint traces of grain dust beneath the nails. Small cuts marked his palms. His shoulders would ache a little when he woke. But for now, his body rested completely. Across the lane, another family slept indoors rather than upon the roof. Their small oil lamp had burned out hours before, leaving only the soft gray outline of the room visible through the growing light outside. Clay jars stood neatly against one wall. Woven baskets rested beside them. A grinding stone waited silently for another morning's work. Everything seemed to pause together. Even the objects inside the home appeared to be resting before another busy day. Near the riverbank, a group of water birds began to wake. One stretched its wings. Another stepped carefully through the shallow water. Soon a gentle chorus of quiet calls spread across the marshes. Their voices were never loud. Instead, they blended naturally with the peaceful sounds already filling the valley. The breeze strengthened just enough to ripple the water. Papyrus stems swayed together. Palm leaves rustled overhead. The scent of wet reeds drifted through the air. Far away across the cultivated fields, cattle shifted slowly where they had rested through the night. One ox lifted its head. Another flicked its tail lazily. They sensed the changing light before the people did. Morning belonged to them as much as it belonged to anyone. The first faint colors now touched the eastern sky. Soft gray became pale blue. Blue slowly welcomed hints of gentle rose and warm gold. The transformation happened so gradually that it felt almost like breathing. Nothing rushed. Nothing demanded attention. The world simply became lighter. On one rooftop, a little girl opened her eyes. She blinked slowly. For several quiet moments she simply watched the brightening sky above her. She pulled the light linen covering around her shoulders as the cool breeze touched her face. Beside her, her older brother still slept peacefully. She listened to his slow breathing before quietly sitting up. She knew better than to wake the others. Instead, she watched the birds circling above the river. She wondered where they went each morning. Perhaps they followed the water. Perhaps they simply enjoyed the cool air before the sun climbed high. Children often found quiet wonder in ordinary things. Soon enough, she would help her mother grind grain and fetch water. But for these few peaceful moments, she simply watched the morning arrive. Not far away, the fisherman in the boat finally sat upright. He stretched his back carefully. The gentle rocking of the river had eased much of yesterday's stiffness. He untied the cloth covering his folded net. Patient fingers checked each knot one final time. Everything looked ready. He dipped a small clay cup into the Nile and drank cool water before beginning the day's work. No words were needed. The morning itself felt complete. In another corner of the village, the old grandfather slowly descended from the rooftop staircase. His feet knew every step without needing to look. Inside the house, he quietly prepared the cooking fire. He arranged small pieces of dry reed, a little wood, a handful of straw. Soon a tiny flame appeared. It flickered softly before growing into a steady glow. The first gentle smell of wood smoke drifted into the cool morning air. One household had awakened. Before long, another would follow. Then another. Soon the peaceful silence of the night would gradually become the familiar rhythm of another ordinary day beside the Nile. The grinding stones would begin their slow song. Fresh bread would fill the air with its warm scent. Farmers would shoulder their tools. Boats would push away from the riverbank. Children would laugh quietly as they carried water or helped with morning chores. Nothing extraordinary would happen. And yet, in these simple routines, the great civilization of ancient Egypt quietly lived another day, shaped not only by pharaohs and monuments, but by countless ordinary people who greeted each sunrise with patient hands, steady hearts, and lives lived in harmony with the timeless rhythm of the Nile. The first light of dawn spread gently across the eastern sky. It did not arrive all at once. Instead, it slowly reached across the Nile Valley like a quiet hand lifting the darkness from the fields. The stars nearest the horizon had disappeared completely now, while those higher above faded one by one until only the brightest remained for a few lingering moments. The river welcomed the morning with the same calm grace it had shown through the night. Its surface reflected soft shades of rose, pale gold, and gentle blue. Small ripples carried these colors downstream, blending them together before separating them once again. A thin mist rested above the water in places where the cool night air met the warmer current below. The village was beginning to awaken. Not suddenly. Never suddenly. One home stirred, then another. A wooden door opened with a quiet creak. Somewhere nearby, a woven mat was carefully rolled and set against a wall. A child yawned softly before rubbing sleepy eyes. The peaceful silence slowly gave way to the familiar sounds that greeted every new day. The old grandfather had already coaxed the cooking fire into a steady flame. Its warm glow illuminated the simple room, casting gentle shadows along the mud brick walls. He placed a clay pot above the fire and poured in fresh water carried from the Nile the evening before. Soon the quiet crackle of burning reeds filled the room. The smell of smoke drifted outside, joining the first cooking fires rising from neighboring homes. Across the lane, another family climbed down from their rooftop where they had spent the cool night beneath the open sky. The youngest boy carefully rolled his sleeping mat, trying to copy the neat movements of his older sister. His first attempt left the mat loose and uneven. His sister smiled. Without saying much, she unrolled it again and showed him how to begin from one end, pressing gently with both hands as she worked. The boy tried once more. This time it held together. He looked pleased with himself. Learning happened quietly in moments like these. No lesson was announced. No praise was expected. Skills simply passed from one pair of hands to another. Nearby, the mother uncovered yesterday's bread. The loaves had remained soft beneath their linen cloth. She sliced one carefully with a bronze knife while her daughter measured grain for the morning's fresh flour. Soon the familiar rhythm returned. Stone against stone. Forward. Back. Forward. back. The grinding stone sang its slow song once again. It was a sound heard in nearly every household throughout Egypt each morning. The movement required strength, but also patience. Hands settled into an easy rhythm. Shoulders moved gently with each stroke. Fine flour slowly gathered beneath the upper stone, ready to become another day's bread. Outside, the cool air still lingered. Farmers welcomed these precious hours before the full heat of the sun would arrive. One by one, they stepped into the narrow streets carrying wooden tools worn smooth by many seasons of work. Neighbors greeted one another with quiet smiles. No long conversations were needed. Most would see each other again before sunset. The village shared the same daily rhythm. Everyone understood where the others were going. A father adjusted the simple rope binding his sandals. Beside him walked his oldest son, still young enough to ask questions about nearly everything they passed. The boy pointed toward a flock of birds lifting from the marshes. "Where are they going?" The father looked up for a moment before answering gently. "They are beginning their own day's work." The boy nodded thoughtfully. He watched until the birds became tiny shapes against the brightening sky. Then he continued walking beside his father toward the fields. Along the riverbank, fishermen untied their boats. The ropes were damp with morning dew. Hands moved confidently through familiar knots before gently pushing each vessel away from shore. The boats glided almost silently into the calm current. Long poles pressed against the riverbed. Wooden paddles dipped quietly into the water. The Nile carried them forward with effortless patience. Mist still hovered above parts of the river. As each boat passed through it, the fishermen seemed to disappear for a moment before slowly emerging once again into the morning light. It was a peaceful sight. One that repeated itself nearly every day of the year. Farther downstream, women arrived carrying empty clay jars balanced carefully upon folded cloth. The river reflected their silhouettes as they knelt near the water's edge. Each jar filled with a gentle bubbling sound. The water was cool against their hands. Some paused after filling their jars. They watched the sunrise spread farther across the valley. The moment required no words. It had become a familiar companion through countless mornings. Nearby, children searched the damp riverbank for smooth shells and interesting stones while their mothers finished collecting water. Every now and then one child would proudly hold up a particularly beautiful pebble, turning it in the growing sunlight before slipping it into a small pouch tied at the waist. Simple treasures often brought the greatest joy. Back in the village, the market slowly came to life. Merchants swept yesterday's dust from the ground before arranging baskets of onions, garlic, figs, dates, beans, and fresh greens harvested from nearby gardens. A potter carefully placed newly fired bowls upon a woven cloth outside his workshop. Each vessel caught the morning light differently. Some carried a soft reddish color. Others showed pale shades of brown shaped by the heat of the kiln. The potter examined each one carefully. A tiny crack hidden beneath the rim. A slightly uneven base. Most were just right. Years of experience had taught his eyes to notice even the smallest details. Across the street, a carpenter opened the shutters of his workshop. The smell of fresh cut wood drifted into the cool air. His tools rested exactly where he had left them the previous evening. Before beginning work, he paused for a moment. He ran one hand across the smooth surface of a half-finished stool. The wood felt cool beneath his fingertips. He smiled quietly. There was satisfaction in seeing yesterday's careful work waiting patiently to continue today. As the sun climbed a little higher, light reached the tops of the date palms. Golden rays filtered through the leaves, creating gentle patterns upon the dusty ground below. Children carried small baskets toward nearby gardens. An elderly woman sprinkled grain for chickens scratching happily beside the house. A young apprentice hurried carefully across the village carrying rolled sheets of papyrus beneath one arm, making certain they stayed clean and dry. Everywhere, ordinary work had begun again. No one believed these small tasks would be remembered for thousands of years. The farmer guiding his oxen. The woman kneading dough. The fisherman mending a net. The scribe sharpening a reed pen. The potter smoothing wet clay. Each simply completed the work that belonged to the day. Yet together, these countless ordinary mornings quietly sustained one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. As the sunlight grew warmer and the village became fully awake, another peaceful day beside the Nile unfolded with the same gentle rhythm that had carried generations before and would continue, almost unchanged, through generations yet to come. The morning settled gently over the valley. The sun had now arisen fully above the eastern horizon, though its warmth was still pleasant rather than intense. Long shadows stretched across the fields, reaching between rows of grain and vegetable gardens before slowly shrinking as the light climbed higher into the clear Egyptian sky. The air remained fresh. It carried the scent of wet earth from the irrigation canals, the sweetness of flowering plants growing near the riverbanks, and the comforting aroma of bread baking in dozens of homes throughout the village. For a little while longer, the day belonged to the cool hours. Farmers knew this well. They worked steadily while the temperature remained kind. Across one broad field, two brothers walked beside an ox pulling a wooden plow. The animal moved without haste, placing each hoof carefully into the soft black soil left behind by the Nile's yearly flood. The plow cut neat lines through the earth, turning it gently as birds followed behind in search of insects uncovered by the fresh furrows. The older brother guided the ox with quiet confidence. The younger brother walked a few steps behind, carrying a woven basket filled with seed. Every few moments he reached inside, gathered a small handful, and scattered it across the prepared ground with an easy motion that had become more natural each passing season. The seeds disappeared almost at once beneath the dark soil. For now, they were hidden. Only time, sunlight, water, and patience would bring them back into view. Neither brother stopped to think about each individual seed. They trusted the rhythm they had known since childhood. The flood would come. The flood would leave. The fields would be planted. The grain would grow. The harvest would arrive. The cycle continued, year after year, asking only steady work in return. Not far away, another farmer knelt beside a narrow irrigation channel. A small section of the mud wall had weakened during the night, allowing precious water to spill into the wrong place. He scooped wet earth with both hands. Slowly he pressed fresh mud into the opening. Again and again. He smoothed the surface with his palms until the water once more followed its intended path. The repair took only a short while. Still, it mattered. A single broken bank could slowly waste water needed by many families. Small acts of care protected much larger harvests. The canal flowed quietly onward. The farmer washed the mud from his hands before returning to his work. Meanwhile, life along the river gathered its own gentle rhythm. Boats moved silently through the morning mist that still lingered in shaded places. Some carried fishermen checking their woven traps. Others transported baskets of vegetables, bundles of flax, or jars of oil between neighboring settlements. The river served as both road and companion. Travel upon the Nile often felt easier than walking beneath the growing warmth of the sun. One elderly boatman stood at the stern of his small vessel with a long steering oar resting comfortably in his hands. He had guided boats along these waters for most of his life. He understood the quiet language of the current. He knew where the water flowed swiftly. He knew where hidden sandbanks rested just below the surface. He knew which bends welcomed cool breezes during the hottest afternoons. His knowledge had not come from books. It had arrived one sunrise at a time. As the boat drifted northward, he watched a family of ducks glide between the reeds. Tiny ducklings followed closely behind their mother, leaving delicate lines across the calm water. The old boatman smiled. The sight pleased him every spring. Some things never lost their simple beauty. Back in the village, the marketplace slowly filled with familiar faces. There was no loud shouting. People moved from one stall to another at an easy pace, greeting neighbors they had known for many years. One woman examined fresh onions before choosing several for her household. A merchant carefully weighed dried beans using simple balance scales. Nearby, another customer traded a basket she had woven during the winter months for jars of oil and handfuls of fragrant herbs. Every exchange depended upon trust. People knew one another's families. They knew who shaped the strongest pottery, who baked the softest bread, who grew the sweetest figs. The marketplace was more than a place to exchange goods. It was where news traveled gently through conversation. Someone spoke of healthy crops growing upriver. Another mentioned that relatives would soon arrive by boat. An older man shared memories of a particularly generous flood many years before. No one seemed eager to finish speaking. Morning still offered plenty of time. In one shaded corner, the village potter had already begun another day's work. Fresh clay rested beneath a damp cloth to keep it soft. He uncovered only a small portion at a time. Too much exposed clay would dry too quickly beneath the Egyptian sun. He placed a lump upon his wheel. With one foot, he slowly turned it. His hands settled lightly against the cool clay. Almost immediately the shapeless mound began to rise. First a cylinder. Then a graceful curve. Then the rounded body of a storage jar. The potter rarely looked surprised by what he created. His hands remembered each movement long before his thoughts did. Every gentle touch shaped the vessel a little more. If the walls became too thin, they might collapse. If they remained too thick, the jar would become unnecessarily heavy. Balance mattered. Patience mattered. The clay rewarded careful attention. Across the lane, a young apprentice watched with quiet fascination. He had seen the process many times before. Still, each new vessel seemed almost magical. The potter noticed the boy watching. Without speaking, he motioned him closer. The apprentice knelt beside the wheel. The older craftsman gently guided the boy's hands onto the spinning clay. The young fingers trembled slightly. The clay wobbled. Its smooth shape leaned to one side. The potter smiled kindly. He steadied the vessel with calm hands. "There is no need to hurry," he said softly. The apprentice nodded. He relaxed. The clay slowly returned to the center. Sometimes the greatest lesson was simply learning to slow down. As the morning continued, sunlight spread across every rooftop. Women hung freshly washed linen where the warm breeze could dry it. Bright white cloth fluttered gently against the blue sky. Nearby, children helped sweep courtyards with bundles of reeds tied together into simple brooms. Dust rose briefly before settling again. Their work was small. Yet it made each home cleaner and more welcoming. One little boy paused halfway through sweeping. A butterfly had landed upon the edge of a clay jar. Its pale wings opened and closed with delicate slowness. He watched quietly until it lifted into the air and drifted toward a nearby garden. Only then did he return to his chore. There was always time to notice small wonders. The village continued to awaken completely now. Smoke curled lazily upward from ovens. The gentle tapping of carpenters echoed from shaded workshops. Grinding stones sang their steady morning rhythm. The laughter of children mixed with the peaceful sounds of birds calling from the palms. Above them all, the sun climbed a little higher, preparing to warm the valley once again. The people felt its approach. They adjusted their pace without needing to speak about it. The busiest work would be done before the greatest heat arrived. This quiet understanding connected everyone. From the farmer tending his fields, to the fisherman watching the river, to the scribe preparing fresh ink, to the grandmother weaving linen beside her doorway. Each person moved with the same timeless rhythm, shaped not by clocks, but by the rising sun, the flowing Nile, and the steady pulse of ordinary life that carried ancient Egypt gently from one peaceful day into the next. By now, the sun had climbed higher into the sky, and the valley had fully settled into the shape of a new day. The light grew stronger, spreading across the fields in wide, steady waves. The soft coolness of morning was slowly replaced by warmth that would soon become heat. Still, for this moment, the air remained bearable, even comfortable in its own quiet way. Life continued without pause. It never truly began or ended here. It simply flowed forward, like the Nile itself. In the fields, farmers adjusted their pace as the sun changed. The early planting was already complete in many places, so attention turned toward maintenance and care. Small weeds were pulled from between rows of grain. Irrigation channels were checked once more to ensure the water still moved where it should. A man stood at the edge of a field holding a wooden rake. He paused for a moment and looked across the land. Not in pride, and not in worry. Just observation. The field looked as it always did at this stage of the season. Dark soil. Young shoots beginning to show. Water glinting faintly in narrow channels. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something only he understood, and returned to his work. Nearby, a group of laborers worked together to strengthen a low embankment along a canal. They passed wet earth from hand to hand, packing it carefully into place. The rhythm of their movement was steady and unspoken. One man pressed the mud firmly with both palms. Another smoothed it after him. A third checked the flow of water, making sure it continued in a controlled path. There was no rush. Only attention. Only repetition. This was the kind of work that held entire seasons together. Farther away, the river carried its own quiet activity. Small trading boats moved along the current, their sails occasionally catching a light breeze that came down from the north. The fabric lifted and settled again, never fully still. On one boat, a merchant sat beside carefully stacked goods wrapped in linen cloth. Bundles of flax. Small baskets of dried fruit. Clay jars sealed with simple plugs of wax. He watched the river banks pass slowly. Villages appeared and faded. Palm groves rose and disappeared. The world along the Nile always felt like a series of connected moments rather than distant places. Everything belonged to the same long ribbon of water. As the boat continued its journey, the merchant leaned slightly back and closed his eyes for a moment. Not to sleep deeply. Just to rest. The sound of water against wood was constant and soothing. Back in the village, the market had grown warmer and busier. The morning's calm trading had shifted into a more active rhythm. People moved between stalls with slightly quicker steps now, aware that the heat would soon intensify. A woman carefully counted out small pieces of grain before placing them into a woven basket. A man tested the weight of a clay jar by lifting it briefly with both hands. A young girl held tightly onto her mother's robe as they passed through the crowd. Nothing felt hurried in a modern sense. Yet everything carried awareness of the rising sun. In one shaded corner, a scribe sat with papyrus spread across a low wooden board. His posture was straight, though relaxed. Before him lay a simple record, quantities of grain, names of workers, and notes about deliveries from nearby settlements. He dipped his reed pen into ink made from soot and water, then carefully added another line of symbols. Each mark required attention. Each stroke mattered. His hand moved slowly, but without hesitation. He did not look up often. The world around him continued without needing his participation, yet his work quietly shaped how that world functioned. Nearby, a potter finished placing a row of newly formed vessels in the sun. They would dry slowly throughout the day. He checked them one by one, ensuring none leaned too far or risked collapsing in the heat. A small adjustment here. A gentle touch there. Even clay needed care after shaping. Across the village, the rhythm of midday preparation was beginning. Women stirred pots of lentils and grains, preparing meals that would be ready before the strongest heat arrived. Bread was gathered and set aside in shaded storage areas. Water jars were checked and refilled. Children were called back from play near the riverbank. Their energy remained bright, but even they understood the importance of returning home before the sun became too strong. The sky above had turned a clearer, sharper blue. Clouds were rare here, and when they appeared, they were thin and distant, more like faint brush strokes than solid shapes. The sun itself now held the center of everything. Its presence shaped movement, rest, and labor alike. Yet even in this growing brightness, there was no sense of struggle. The people of the Nile Valley had long learned how to move with the day rather than against it. Inside homes, coolness remained where thick mud brick walls blocked the direct heat. Families gathered in shaded rooms or under covered courtyards. Some lay down briefly to rest. Others sat quietly and mended clothing, repaired tools, or simply waited for the heat to pass. Conversation softened. Voices lowered. Even thought seemed to slow. Outside, the village was quieter now. Not empty. Just calmer. The strongest work of the morning had been completed. What remained could wait until the sun began its descent. At the river's edge, a fisherman checked his nets once more. He lifted them carefully from the water, feeling the weight of what they carried. A modest catch. Enough for the day. He nodded to himself and secured the net again. The river gave what it could, when it could. There was no more to ask of it. He looked upstream for a long moment. The water flowed steadily, unchanged in its pace, unaffected by the heat above. Then he turned and began walking back toward the village. Slow steps. Familiar path. The sound of distant grinding stones echoed faintly across the air as he passed between palm trees. Somewhere, a child laughed briefly before being called back inside. Somewhere else, a door closed gently. The village moved toward the middle of the day's rest. A pause, not of stillness, but of softened activity. A shared understanding that the sun would soon reach its highest point, and that life would continue more gently until it began its slow descent again. And so, under the bright and unwavering Egyptian sky, the ordinary world continued its quiet balance between effort and rest, guided always by the river that never stopped flowing, and the sun that never stopped rising, shaping each day with steady, ancient certainty. The sun reached its highest point over the Nile Valley. At this hour, the light felt heavier, as if it pressed gently down upon the land. Shadows shrank beneath walls and trees until they became small, almost invisible marks on the ground. The air itself seemed to slow, holding warmth that wrapped around everything without urgency. The village entered its quietest stage of the day. Not asleep. Not active. Something in between. Inside the mud brick homes, the coolness held steady in shaded rooms. Families rested where they could, finding relief from the heat in stillness. Some lay stretched out on woven mats, eyes closed, breathing slow and even. Others remained seated, fanning themselves gently with pieces of woven palm or folded cloth. No one spoke loudly. Even conversations became brief and soft. Outside, the streets were nearly empty now. The dust lay still on the ground, undisturbed by footsteps. Only an occasional movement broke the calm, perhaps a goat shifting in the shade, or a bird fluttering from one rooftop to another. Near the river, the Nile continued its steady motion. The surface had changed under the strong sun. Where morning had brought softness and mist, midday now revealed brightness so strong it almost hurt the eyes. Light reflected off the water in long, shimmering paths that moved with every small ripple. A fisherman sat beneath a cluster of reeds along the bank. He had chosen this place carefully. The shade was thin but enough to make the heat bearable. His boat rested nearby, pulled slightly onto the mud. Nets lay folded beside him, damp and heavy from earlier use. He did not work now. There was nothing to be done during this part of the day. Instead, he simply waited. Waiting was a skill in itself. He watched the river without expectation. Sometimes a fish broke the surface. Sometimes the wind shifted slightly and brought a brief moment of relief. Most of the time, there was only stillness. The fisherman closed his eyes for a moment. Not to sleep deeply. Just to rest his thoughts. Farther inland, workers who could not avoid the heat continued carefully with lighter tasks. A group of builders moved stone tools and wooden sledges into shaded storage areas. Their movements were slower than in the morning, more deliberate. They drank often from clay jars kept cool beneath damp cloths. Each sip was small but meaningful. Water was never taken for granted here. At a nearby workshop, a potter sat inside a shaded enclosure, continuing delicate finishing work on vessels that had already dried in the morning sun. He smoothed edges with a damp cloth, checking for imperfections that might not have been visible earlier. A small crack. A rough edge. A slightly uneven curve. These were corrected quietly, with patient hands. Nothing was rushed. The heat encouraged patience more than speed. Across the village, children had settled indoors. Some slept without meaning to, overcome by the warmth and quiet. Others remained awake, lying beside family members and watching faint patterns of light move across the walls as the sun shifted outside. A young boy traced shapes in the dust on the floor with one finger. Slow lines. Simple curves. He was not thinking of anything in particular. Only passing the time in a way that felt natural. In another home, a scribe sat in a dim room where thick walls blocked much of the sunlight. The air was cooler here, though still warm. He carefully reviewed earlier records written that morning. His reed pen rested beside him. Ink had dried slightly on its tip. He dipped it again into the small clay dish, then corrected a line of symbols with precise movements. His work demanded attention even when the world outside was at rest. Numbers. Names. Amounts of grain. Everything had to remain accurate. Nearby, a small administrative storehouse remained quiet but not empty. Clay seals marked jars and baskets stacked carefully against the walls. A caretaker moved slowly through the space, checking that nothing had been disturbed. The heat outside made the interior feel almost sacred in its stillness. Even the air inside seemed to wait. Outside again, the river held its endless rhythm. The midday light made it appear almost golden in places. Reeds along the banks bent slightly under the heat, their green softened into deeper tones. A few birds stood motionless in shallow water, barely moving except for the occasional tilt of their heads. A group of travelers passed along the river path. Their steps were slow. They carried light bundles wrapped in cloth, likely supplies for a nearby settlement. No one spoke much. The heat discouraged unnecessary words. Yet there was no discomfort in their silence. It felt natural, like everything else in the valley at this hour. Far in the distance, the desert shimmered. Heat rising from its surface created a wavering illusion, making the horizon appear fluid, as though the land itself were gently breathing. But nothing there moved. It simply existed, vast and patient, surrounding the green ribbon of life that followed the Nile. In the village, a woman slowly fanned herself beside a half-finished basket. Her movements were steady, almost meditative. She paused occasionally to drink water, then returned to her weaving without hurry. The basket would not be finished today. That was acceptable. Time was shaped by the sun, not by urgency. As the hour deepened, even the smallest sounds softened further. A door creaked once and then remained still. A clay pot shifted slightly as it cooled in the shade. A distant animal call faded into the heat. Everything seemed to hold itself gently in place. The world was not asleep, but it was resting. Waiting for the moment when the sun would begin its slow descent, when shadows would stretch again across the fields, and when movement would gradually return to the village like a soft tide. Until then, the Nile Valley remained suspended in warm stillness, carried forward not by effort, but by the steady, unchanging passage of time itself. The heat of midday began, little by little, to soften. It was not a sudden change. The sun still stood high, still bright, still strong above the valley. But something subtle shifted in the way its light touched the land. The edges of shadows began to stretch again, almost imperceptibly at first, as the sun slowly turned its path toward the west. Inside the village, the quiet rest of the afternoon held on. Homes remained cool in their shaded interiors. Mud brick walls kept the harshest light outside, holding a steady calm within. Families continued to rest, to wait, to move only when necessary. Even breathing seemed slower in these hours, as if the entire village shared a single long pause. A woman in one house opened her eyes and lay still for a moment. The room around her was dim and peaceful. She listened. No urgent sounds. No calls. No movement beyond the soft presence of her family nearby. Only the faint whisper of wind slipping through small gaps in the wall. She turned her head slightly and closed her eyes again. There was still time before work would fully return. Outside, the river carried on unchanged. The Nile never paused for heat or rest. It continued its steady movement, reflecting the sky in a pale, shimmering sheet. Now and then, a small ripple passed across its surface, breaking the reflection into soft fragments before smoothing again into calm. Along the shaded bank, the fisherman who had rested earlier stirred. He opened his eyes slowly and sat up. The sun had shifted slightly westward now. Not enough to cool the air yet, but enough to signal the coming return of activity. He reached for his net. Its weight was familiar in his hands. Before working again, he drank a few sips of water from a clay jar kept cool in the shade. The taste was simple, clean, and deeply refreshing after the long stillness of midday. He did not rush. There was no need. The river would remain. The fish would move when they moved. The day would unfold as it always did. Farther inland, small signs of life began to return. A door opened quietly in the village. Then another. A child stepped outside briefly, squinting at the brightness, before retreating back into the shade. Somewhere, a grinding stone began to move again, slowly at first, then with steady rhythm as a household prepared for the next meal. Stone against stone. Soft. Repetitive. Familiar. The sound marked the gentle return of movement. In a shaded workshop, a potter examined the vessels left drying earlier in the day. The clay had hardened now, becoming firm under the heat. He tapped one lightly with his knuckle, listening to the sound it made. A clear tone meant strength. A dull sound might suggest weakness. He selected a few pieces and set them aside for firing later. Others were returned for correction or repair. Nothing was wasted, but nothing imperfect was left unnoticed either. Nearby, a carpenter stepped back into his workspace. He ran a hand across the surface of a half-finished wooden frame. The grain of the wood felt warmer now than it had in the morning. He picked up his tools and resumed careful shaping, working slowly as the light softened around him. Outside again, the riverbank began to show more movement. Women returned with empty jars to collect water for the evening hours. Their steps were lighter now than earlier, the heat no longer pressing quite so heavily upon them. Children followed behind, this time with more energy returning to their movements. One boy ran a few steps ahead before being gently called back by his sister. "Not too fast," she said softly. He slowed, though reluctantly. The afternoon still required care. The marketplace, too, began to stir once more. Merchants uncovered their goods from shaded coverings. Fresh fruit was arranged again. Baskets were straightened. Clay jars were set back into neat rows. A few early customers appeared, moving between stalls with a little more energy than before. The village was waking from its midday rest in the same gradual way it had fallen into it. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Meanwhile, the fields beyond the village caught the changing light. The sun was lower now, though still strong. Farmers who had rested during the hottest hours began to return. Some walked slowly from their homes. Others already stood at the edges of their fields, checking irrigation channels, inspecting crops, or preparing tools for the final stretch of the day. The oxen were brought out again. Their bodies moved with calm acceptance, as though they too understood the rhythm of work returning after rest. A farmer placed a hand on the animal's neck for a moment. A quiet gesture. Then he guided it forward. The plow moved once more through the soil, though now the pace was gentler than in the morning. The earth yielded easily, softened by earlier moisture and time. Above it all, the sky had changed. The brilliant white blue of midday had begun to warm. Soft gold crept into the edges of the horizon. The desert, still distant and unmoving, reflected the light in a hazy glow that made it feel almost close enough to touch. The Nile itself caught the change first. Its surface no longer felt like midday firelight. Instead, it shimmered with a calmer brightness, as if preparing for something softer. A transition was always happening here. Even when nothing seemed to move quickly, everything was always becoming something else. Inside homes, families began to prepare for the evening meal. Water was set over small fires. Bread was uncovered. Leftover grain was ground again for fresh dough. The scent of cooking began to drift gently through the village, mixing with the cooling air that followed the sun's slow descent. A child sat near a doorway watching shadows stretch across the ground. Earlier in the day, those shadows had been small and tight. Now they lengthened, reaching further with each passing moment. The child placed a hand on the earth, feeling its warmth slowly fade. Above, birds began to shift in the sky. Small groups circled once, then moved toward the river or the reeds, preparing for the evening's gathering. Their movement marked what everyone already felt without needing words. The day was changing again. The village would soon move from work to rest, from heat to coolness, from brightness into the gentle beginning of evening. And as always, the Nile would continue its steady flow through it all, unchanged in its patience, carrying the memory of the day forward into the soft hours that would follow. The sun continued its slow descent toward the western horizon. Its light, once sharp and overhead, now spread wider across the land. It no longer pressed down with the same weight. Instead, it stretched and softened, turning the Nile Valley into a place of long shadows and warm gold. The village changed with it. Not quickly. Not all at once. But in the steady rhythm that defined every hour of life here. In the fields, farmers finished the last tasks of the day. Tools were gathered carefully, each one placed back where it belonged. Wooden handles, worn smooth by years of use, were carried over shoulders as men walked slowly along narrow paths between fields. The oxen, now freed from their work, stood quietly chewing in the fading light. Their bodies were tired in the way of long, steady labor, but calm. There was no restlessness in them. Only the quiet acceptance of another day completed. A farmer paused at the edge of a canal and looked at the water. It flowed the same as it always did. Unchanged. Unhurried. He bent down, touched the surface briefly with his fingers, then stood again. The water carried away the small ripples without hesitation, as if nothing had disturbed it at all. Behind him, the fields rested. Seeds beneath the soil. Green shoots beginning their slow rise. The work of many hands now left to time, sun, and river. Farther along the riverbank, the Nile reflected the evening sky more deeply now. Gold had begun to fade into amber. Amber into soft orange. And beyond that, the first hints of deepening blue. The water held all of it at once, blending colors in a way that felt endless and calm. A fisherman pulled his boat closer to shore. This return was familiar. His movements were slow but practiced. Rope tightened in his hands. Wood scraped softly against mud as the boat settled into place. Nets were lifted and checked, their weight telling him everything he needed to know about the day. Some catch. Not much. Enough. That simple understanding carried through many lives along the river. He did not speak. There was no need. Around him, other boats returned as well, dotting the riverbank in quiet order. Men stepped out one by one, stretching their backs, rolling their shoulders, letting the stillness of land replace the constant motion of water. The village beyond them had fully awakened again from its midday pause. Smoke now arose more steadily from cooking fires. Not thin strands like before, but fuller, more confident curls drifting upward into the cooling air. The smell of food spread gently through narrow streets. Bread warming again. Stew simmering slowly. Grain softening in clay pots. Families preparing the final meal of the day with unhurried hands. Inside one home, a woman stirred a pot while listening to the sound of her children returning from outside. Their footsteps were lighter now, more playful than earlier in the day. The heat had left them, and with it, some of the quiet heaviness of midday. One child carried a small bundle of reeds for the fire. Another held a shallow bowl filled with water from the river. Each had a small task. Each knew where they were needed without needing to be told twice. In another house, a scribe finished his day's writing. He set down his reed pen carefully beside the inkstone. His hands paused above the papyrus for a moment, as if making sure everything was complete. Records of grain. Lists of workers. Small notes that would help the village function smoothly tomorrow. He rolled the papyrus slowly and tied it with a thin cord. Then he placed it into a woven storage basket beside him. The room was quiet now. He leaned back slightly and closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the stillness settle around him. Outside, the streets of the village were once again alive, but differently than in the morning. Not rushed. Not driven by the urgency of early work. This was a gentler movement. People returning. Gathering. Preparing to end the day together. A group of children sat near a doorway, watching the sky shift colors. One of them pointed toward the horizon where the sun was now a glowing shape touching the edge of the desert. No one spoke for a moment. They simply watched. The changing light required no explanation. The sky itself seemed to teach them how to be still. Along the river, women returned from the water with fill jars balanced carefully on their shoulders. Their silhouettes moved slowly against the fading light. The jars caught small reflections of the sky, as if carrying pieces of evening home with them. Their steps were steady, balanced, familiar. Nearby, a group of travelers arrived at the village edge. Their clothing carried dust from distant paths. They moved carefully through the narrowing streets, looking for rest, water, and shade. No one hurried to greet them loudly. Instead, simple nods and quiet gestures guided them toward places where they could pause and recover. Hospitality here was not spoken loudly. It was understood. The sun now touched the horizon fully. The desert to the west glowed with deep, warm color, as though holding on to the last moments of daylight before releasing them. Shadows stretched long across the fields again, returning in a different form than they had in the morning. Now they were softer, longer, less sharp. Everything seemed to slow with them. Even sound felt different. Quieter. More open. A child ran briefly across a courtyard, laughing once before being called back inside. The sound faded quickly into the wider calm of evening preparation. Inside homes, lamps were readied. Oil poured. Wicks trimmed. Flames prepared but not yet lit. People moved with the instinct of countless evenings before this one. The rhythm of ending the day was as familiar as beginning it. The Nile flowed beside all of it, unchanged, unmoved by the day's labor or its ending, carrying everything forward with quiet certainty. As the sun finally began to sink below the edge of the world, the village entered that gentle space between day and night. A moment of transition. Soft, slow, and full of the quiet understanding that tomorrow would arrive the same way it always had. Without rush. Without noise. Just the steady return of light over water, fields, and the lives of those who lived beside them. Night returns to the Nile Valley the way it always has. Slowly. Quietly. Without announcement. The last light of the sun fades beyond the western desert, leaving behind a sky that deepens into soft indigo. One by one, the first stars appear again, patient and steady, as if they had never truly left. Their light rests gently over the river, over the fields, over the small homes gathered close to the water. The village becomes still once more. Not empty. Just at rest. Inside the houses, the lamps glow softly. Not bright enough to push away the night, only enough to make small circles of warmth inside the darkness. Families gather close together on woven mats. The day's work has ended, and what remains is only the quiet presence of home. A father sits near the doorway for a while before sleep. he listens to the night sounds he has always known. The river beyond the village moving in its endless way. The wind passing through reeds. The distant call of a night bird. His children are already asleep behind him. Their breathing is slow and even, their bodies relaxed after a long day that now feels far away. He closes his eyes. Not because there is anything to escape, but because everything is finally still. Outside, the Nile continues its journey. It does not pause for night or day. It does not remember or forget. It simply flows, carrying with it the waters of distant lands, the memory of mountains far to the south, and the promise of life that returns every morning without fail. Along its banks, the fields rest. The seeds beneath the soil wait quietly. The reeds along the water stand unmoving in the dark. The desert beyond remains vast and silent, holding its ancient stillness under the same sky. Everything is in balance. Everything is where it should be. In one small boat near the shore, a fisherman sleeps with his cloth pulled close against the cool air. His nets lie beside him, carefully folded, ready for tomorrow. The river rocks him gently, as if it remembers his presence and offers comfort in return. Farther inland, a scribe sleeps beside carefully rolled papyrus. A potter rests with clay still dried on his hands. A farmer lies with the memory of soil still beneath his nails. A child dreams without knowing the shape of tomorrow. None of them think of themselves as part of something large. They are simply living. Simply working. Simply resting. But together, they form the quiet foundation of everything. The civilization that will one day be remembered in stone and writing is not built in a single moment of greatness. It is built here. In bread baked before sunrise. In water carried from the river. In hands that shape clay, guide oxen, mend nets, and write simple records by lamplight. In the patient repetition of days that look almost the same, yet carry life forward one sunrise at a time. The night deepens. The stars continue to turn slowly above the Nile. And the river moves on, as it always has, through darkness and silence, carrying the valley gently toward another dawn that has not yet arrived. Not dramatic. Not final. Just waiting. Like every morning that has ever come before it. The world rests. And the story of ordinary life continues, softly, without end, beneath the ancient sky.